Welcome to another installment of Donning the Armor. This morning we will begin in 1 Kings chapter 9, verse 1. And it came to pass when Solomon had finished building the house of the Lord, and the king's house, and all Solomon's desires which he wanted to do, that the Lord appeared to Solomon the second time, as he had appeared to him at Gibeon. So here we come to Solomon having had the Lord appear to him the first time in Gibeon. He appeared to him in a dream, asking him what he wished, what he felt as though he needed to fulfill the work that the Lord was setting before him. And he asked for wisdom. Not for money, not for fame, not for power, not for might, but for wisdom. The ability to apply all that he knew, and to be wiser than any man, a man worthy enough to lead the people of God. So God grants him this desire and grants him everything else that he didn't ask for, because he asked for something in humility. And since that time, Solomon has built the temple. He has built his own house, the house of his wife. He had these incredible buildings. No expense spared for them, neither the temple or his own home. And now with everything that he had the desire laid on his heart to do, after not only building the temple, but dedicating the temple, bringing the congregation before it, praying and beseeching the Lord, and making that incredible prayer that we saw in chapter 8. After all that's fulfilled, now the Lord is going to appear to Solomon a second time. His prayer, he offered up a lot of petitions upon the Lord, a lot of asking, but also a lot of praise and some promise. He offered up a lot of good words. Now the Lord is going to come before him, say, "Look, I've heard you. I've heard your prayer. You prayed that I would hear your prayer, and I heard it. But I also heard what you said. So here's a reminder of what I've told you before." And the Lord said to him, "I have heard your prayer and your supplication that you have made before me. I have consecrated this house which you have built to put my name there forever. And my eyes and my heart will be there perpetually." So he's saying, look, I've heard your prayer. I heard it. I heard your prayers. I heard your supplications. You made them before me. You made them in my presence. My cloud came down. Everything has been seen. Everything has been done as I promised. I have consecrated this house, which you built to put my name there forever. And my eyes and my heart will be there perpetually. So from here on out, I am going to honor your prayer. I'm going to honor what you asked for. That anytime anyone, no matter where they're at, near or far, in Jerusalem, in Israel, or some far off country, whether they are at war or at exile, or just as a sojourner in a far country, that when they pray to you towards this temple to hear, well, Solomon, I will hear them. My ears, my eyes, and my heart will be there perpetually. For my children, my heart will always be there. Now, if you walk before me as your father David walked, in integrity of heart and in uprightness, to do according to all that I have commanded you, and if you will keep my statutes and my judgments, then I will establish the throne of your kingdom over Israel forever, as I promised David your father, saying, you shall not fail to have a man on the throne of Israel. And now, once again, we get to a bit of the if statements. As a matter of fact, a covenant is an agreement. God always keeps his end of the covenant. The question is, will we? Will we keep the covenant? So in Solomon's case, will he keep his covenant? Because God's end is good. I agreed to this with your father David. If these things are done, then I will make sure this happens. But now the Lord is coming before Solomon as a reminder to say, remember, I said if. There's something you need to do on your part. If you walk the way David did, as a man after my own heart. You walk in integrity of heart and in uprightness. Now, did everything David do, was that with integrity? No, murdering one of your soldiers by the sword of the Ammonites is not uprightness. It's not integrity filled. But his heart was always towards God. Even in David's failings, his heart was always turned towards God. So Solomon, is your heart always going to be turned towards me? If you walk like him, if you walk out your life with your heart always turned towards me, then I will do according to all that I command. I will do all that I promised your father David. If you do what you know you should, you know you have to walk in integrity and uprightness like your father. You know you have to doing to all that I commanded you. You have to keep my statutes and my judgments. If you do those, then I will establish the throne of your kingdom over Israel forever. Because I promised your father that you shall not fail to have a man on the throne of Israel. Now, people could look at this and say, well, he sent them into exile because they went into sinfulness and they fell away from God. But Jesus is the final king. He continues the line of David forever now because he was raised from the dead and then ascended to heaven. So he never died here. So he's still alive in his physical body in heaven at the right hand of the Father making petition for us. So was this really an if? I mean, Solomon fell away. His children fell away. The nation fell away. So was it really an if he still intended to keep it? Well, I guess means how you interpret. It depends on how you interpret throne of Israel. Because although the line of the king never passed from this earth, from David to Jesus, even in the exile, even through the slaughter of the Babylonians, there was still an heir that survived. Each and every time, there is an heir that survives. But are they actually sitting in a throne, on a throne in Israel? No. And they wouldn't be. Even after the exile, when they come back, they still never really regain the kingdom that they had before the exile. They continue to be a vassal state of Persia and then Rome, and each and every time they continue to stay a vassal state. They never get back to what they were. So in that way, they fell away, and there's not a man technically on the throne of Israel. But there was always an heir to fill that throne. There was always an heir that would have been available to fill the throne of Israel if they became a nation again. They became a self-governing monarchy again. But we know that's wasn't really quite what God was getting at anyway. If you continue to walk before me, if you continue to walk in my presence with a heart turned before me and no one else. Always in integrity, always looking to me first. In Revelation, Jesus, one of the 7 churches he writes to, he tells John to write a letter to, and he dictates, says, you've forgotten your first love. You've forgotten your first love. And what is the first love? Is God, as Jesus has told us in Scripture. The greatest commandment is that we shall love the Lord our God with all our heart, mind, and strength. And then from that will flow loving your neighbor as yourself. With that love of God, Solomon, you need to have that love of God. And if that happens, then this kingdom, which I have shown everyone in your reign, will continue. If not, then it won't be this way. And as we continue to read, we'll see that it does not remain that way for long. It is Solomon, and then it fractures, breaks, and the downfall begins from there. But if you or your sons at all turn from following me, and do not keep my commandments and my statutes which I have set before you, but go and serve other gods and worship them, then I will cut off Israel from the land which I have given them, and this house which I have consecrated for my name I will cast out of my sight. Israel will be a proverb and a byword among all peoples. It'll be a word of warning. If you or your sons, your princes who take the throne after you, if they do not keep my commandments and my statutes, if they turn from following me in the way your father David did not, if you go and serve other gods and worship them, then I will cut off Israel from this land. I used Israel to cut off the Canaanites from this land. I will use someone else to cut you off from this land. And this house, this beautiful temple you built, that you consecrated, that has been consecrated in my name, I'll cast it out of my sight. I will no longer pay attention to this place. It'll be so bad that Israel will be a proverb. You will be a cautionary tale to all peoples as to what happens when you do not faithfully honor the Lord. And it's a part of the understanding that some people get and some people don't, and some people wildly misappropriate for things. And that's that Israel, in this way of being cast out and becoming a proverb and becoming this cautionary tale, seem to forget that although the Israelites are God's chosen people, they weren't chosen because they were special. They weren't chosen because they could do something that no one else could do. They weren't chosen for any special abilities or skills that they could bring into the covenant with God, that he could use uniquely that no other people group could do. He used them because they were insignificant. And their only significance came from being the people of God. They're an undersized people. An undersized number of people. So physically and in number, they were undersized. And yet he used them to raise up the biggest, richest kingdom of its time. Purely by his own power. Purely by his own good desire to do so. And if they want to cast him out and set other gods in his presence, serve them and worship them over him, then he will be able to cast them out just the same. Because he doesn't need them. He could raise up this nation to be a blessing for the entire world from any people. He told Moses as much. You know what? They've disgraced themselves and dishonored me so much with the golden calf. I'm just going to destroy them all, Moses, and I'm going to create a new people from you. You will be the new Noah. You will now have a new line come out of you, and you'll be the people who will bless everybody. That's it. I'm done. You'll be the new Abraham. And Moses go, no, hold up, God. Like, let's not be hasty. It wouldn't be good for you. After all, your name is to be exalted. It's not us, but it's you. And if you do this thing, your name will not be exalted in that way. But now we're past that. Now we're to the point where God is saying, look, I have shown the world what I am capable of doing with an insignificant tribe of people. And I can do it again. So if you make me do it again, then you will become a cautionary tale. That's what you will become. You will become a cautionary tale for everyone to look on, reflect on, and instead of you being a blessing that brings people to me because of how much wealth and how amazing you are, people want to know how you got it, and because they're superstitious, they look to gods, and they'll look to your God. Instead, they will look and say, what happened to that place? They displease their God. Oh, well, I do not want to displease their God. I want to please their God. Let's worship their God, as a cautionary tale and a negative example. And that's almost what Israel ends up being. It's why people will talk about the nation of Israel now not being the true Israel of the Bible. Well, sort of and not. There's a spiritual Israel. Yes, in a way. That the Church of Christ makes up a spiritual Israel, yes. But when we look at prophetic scripture that points to an actual physical Israel and a physical Jerusalem, well, that was unimaginable 1,700 years ago, 1,800 years ago. Now we have that again. So once again, this Israel is still the Israel of prophecy, most likely, unless God sees fit to destroy it again and raise it back up. Which he can do. It's God. He can do whatever he chooses to do. That's his thing. That's his thing. I'm not one to question it. I'm just a pot. I don't get to question the molder of the pot. But this has become what it is. Israel was made a proverb. Something we look at in the past and say, these people were God's chosen people. And when God finally sent the Messiah to them, their long-awaited Messiah, they rejected him. They rejected the salvation and the reconciliation that God provided for his people. And now that salvation and reconciliation has gone out to all the peoples. But yet, they still deny. They still refuse. And they still sit at a precipice of not being reconciled to their God. Of not being able to live fully in the embrace of God. Because they refuse to accept the narrow path he set before them. So they do sit here and serve to this day a cautionary tale of what could happen. They're a blessed people, a chosen people. But salvation only comes through Christ. Period. And the refusal to do so leaves them outside of the new covenant that was formed by the Messiah they had awaited. Even Paul would write that if he could give up his own salvation to save his countrymen, his blood brothers in Israel, of all the Israelites, all the Jews, he would. But unfortunately, that's not something we can do. We are each responsible for our own salvation, responsible for listening to the call of God and answering it ourselves. We can't sacrifice ours for someone else, even if we wished we could. That's why it's so important that we don't hold and worry about the cautionary tale, but instead go forth knowing of it and preaching the gospel so that they learn the love of God that we know, and they understand it in the way we understand it, and they understand the beauty and greatness that comes from a loving Father. And we certainly don't want to stand as cautionary tales ourselves. Sitting here with children who end up saved saying, I really wish my father had become saved. I really wish my mother had become saved. I really wish my mother and father had understood the love of Christ. But they refused to come to him when he called. They refused to believe. They refused to accept the good gift of grace because they wished to rely on their works as good people. Because ultimately that's what Israel was. It was a land of a works-based salvation, instituted by God. But the salvation even then came through Christ. It's just it came through an old covenant of substitutionary atonement paid by the sacrifices of the time. And then the grace of God would go out and offer them reconciliation as a shadow of the final sacrifice that was to come. One that didn't become a byword among all peoples, but became the revealed word to all peoples in the way, in Christianity, in following the teachings of Christ, because of the righteousness we are cloaked in, because of the love of Christ and the love of our Father, which is perfectly just and perfectly loving and altogether sovereign. And as for this house, which is exalted, everyone who passes by it will be astonished and will hiss and say, why has the Lord done thus for this land and to this house? Then they will answer, because they forsook the Lord their God, who brought their fathers out of the land of Egypt, and have embraced other gods, and worshipped them, and served them. Therefore the Lord has brought all this calamity on them. So as for the temple, Solomon, which is exalted, everyone that passes by it will be astonished and hiss. That's how bad the destruction will be. That's how that's how bad my wrath will be upon this land if you turn from me. And ends up being a when you turn from me. And the byword and the proverb, all the reasoning. Hey, why, what happened to this place? I remember my fathers talking about this. I remember my forefathers talking about this great temple in this amazing wealthy land of Israel. And they will even answer, because they forsook the Lord their God, who brought them out of Egypt. They embraced other gods. Therefore the Lord brought all this down upon them, all this destruction, all this calamity, as retribution for the dishonor and the disrespect of turning from the one who saved them and the one who brought them out. Now it happened at the end of 20 years, when Solomon had built the two houses, the house of the Lord and the king's house. Hiram, the king of Tyre, had supplied Solomon with cedar and cypress and gold as much as he desired. That King Solomon then gave Hiram 20 cities in the land of Galilee. So this seems to be in the land of Asher, in the tribe of Asher, where that would have been. And he gives them these 20 cities as apparently a way to pay off the debt. This was part of the agreement that Hiram wanted all of this list of supplies to feed his house and all of these different things that Israel could give in repayment for the cypress and the cedar and the gold and everything he brought. Well, apparently these 20 cities were also to be a part of it. King Solomon gives them to him. But Hiram not exactly real happy with them. Then Hiram went from Tyre to see the cities which Solomon had given him, but they did not please him. So he said, "What kind of cities are these which you have given me, my brother?" And he called them the land of Cabul, as they are to this day. Then Hiram sent the king 120 talents of gold. So basically he calls them useless. Like, why do I need these cities? I've read and heard in sermons and commentaries, looking it up, that part of the reason why Hiram did not like these cities was that Tyre, Sidon, these are seafaring people, and the 20 cities are generally landlocked, so they're useless to him. Like, why are you giving me these cities? They don't mean anything to him. But he still sends him gold. He still sends him his supplies. It's not as if this destroyed their alliance, but just that these cities didn't please him. This isn't what he wanted. These aren't the cities that he thought they were going to be. And this is the reason for the labor force which Solomon raised to build the house of the Lord, his own house, the Milo, and the wall of Jerusalem, Hazar, Megiddo, and Gezer. Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, had gone up and taken Gezer and burned it with fire. Move that up a little bit. And burned it with fire, had killed the Canaanites who dwelt in the city, and had given it as a dowry to his daughter, Solomon's wife. So we know Solomon married the daughter of Pharaoh. Well, apparently as the dowry for his daughter, so that if something happened, this would be what she would fall back on to use as wealth. He just went on a rampage and started destroying cities, burning them, killing a bunch of people, taking over the cities. And he's just like, all right, here you go. This is going to be your dowry. This destroyed city and land. And Solomon built Gezer, Lower Beth Horon, Baalath, and Tadmor in the wilderness, in the land of Judah. All the storage cities that Solomon had, cities for his chariots and cities for his cavalry, and whatever Solomon desired to build in Jerusalem, in Lebanon, and all the land of his dominion. And here is kind of part of the issue. If we remember back to Deuteronomy, kings were not to multiply wives. Well, David fell on that one. Saul probably fell for that one. Solomon is going to fall hard on that one. But he was also not to multiply chariots, not to multiply horses, not to go back to Egypt for things. But we're going to see again and again, Solomon is now, he's going to get the wives. He's now got the chariots. And now he's got cities for the chariots. There was a plague during the time of David because he wanted to number his people. Now you have Solomon building cities, entire cities to house his cavalry and his chariots. So in this way, you can see how far Solomon is already beginning to pull away from the ordinances of God. That how far he's already starting to stumble in such an early period of time in his life. I mean, he's 20 years into his reign, sure, maybe a little bit more. So he's halfway through his reign. But you can already see the cracks. You can already see the compromise that he's begun to have in his life. And it doesn't stop here. It continues again and again and again. As more and more people come into his life. As more and more people take precedence over God. The very thing God had just come back and had a second encounter with Solomon for. Telling him and reaffirming him, hey, you said this prayer. You made these supplications. I heard them. Now, if you keep this, and we can already see the if starting to get very tenuous about whether or not Solomon is keeping what he was meant to keep. The statutes and the commandments, which goes back to Deuteronomy, the second giving of the law, about not multiplying things because it's not about your power, it's about God's power. The whole reason Israel was used is because they were insignificant, because it magnified the power of God in the sight of all the other nations. Now Solomon is beginning to look as though he's magnifying his own power to all the nations. And nothing good ever comes from magnifying ourselves and exalting ourselves. After all, we saw what happened with Adonijah when he went to exalt himself before Solomon was given the throne. All the people who were left to the Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, they were not of the children of Israel. That is their descendants who were left in the land after them, whom the children of Israel had not been able to destroy completely. From these Solomon raised forced labor, as it is to this day. But of the children of Israel Solomon made no forced laborers, because they were men of war, and his servants, his officers, his captains, his commanders of his chariots, and his cavalry. So of the other people of these other nations, they were into forced labor. Now, does that exactly mean slavery in the chattel slavery that our minds constantly go to? Not necessarily. I mean, I mention that every time we have to talk about slavery, but it's just the truth is that slavery in the ancient world was prevalent everywhere, but often was not exactly what we would consider when we think of the slave trade, which ironically was not even the worst slave trade going on at its time, let alone throughout history, because the Muslim slave trade going on at the same time through the Arab world, the Arab slave trade, was far more vicious and far more brutal. People will say, well, the Arabs never seized the progeny, the children of their slaves. Like the slave trade that the Europeans and Americans, because we were Europeans at the time, were engaged in. We would buy a slave. That person would have a child. That slave would then be our slave. That's the way that worked in the Western world. In the Arabian slave trade, that didn't happen. And people say, see, but they didn't do that. No, because when they bought a man, they castrated him immediately. So there were a whole bunch of other horrors that they did. One, because they had harems there. And they didn't want them. They didn't want them being used in siring children with women in their harem. So they castrate them and then make them work like oxen until they died. Typically, you'd be thrown into a boat to row until you die, and then just be thrown in the water and replaced with a new one. So the prevalence of slave trade has never not been a thing in the world. It's still a thing in the world today. People just don't like to talk about it because you can't. It's not it's not a political football to kick around anymore. Guilt over slavery is a political football. Trying to end slavery in foreign nations, you can't milk money out of that, because then you got to do something too. It's better just to guilt people into things so that you can cry about it and then milk money out of it. So that's why we tend to think of slavery the way it is. Now, is that what Solomon's engaged in? Actual slavery? It says forced labor. Or is it more akin to the slavery that they were already allowed to have in bond servitude? That's up for debate, and different commentators say different things, and I'm pretty sure different scholars say different things, because biblical scholars, oftentimes you'll find, are people that don't even really believe in the authority of the Bible. So their scholarship gets a little iffy because they're already trying to deny what is plainly written in order to come up with an explanation that fits what they believe it should fit. Others were chiefs of the officials who were over Solomon's work, 550, who ruled over the people who did the work. But Pharaoh's daughter came up from the city of David to her house which Solomon had built for her. Then he built the Milo. Now 3 times a year Solomon offered burnt offerings and peace offerings on the altar which he had built for the Lord. And he burned incense with them on the altar that was before the Lord. So he finished the temple. So 3 times a year he's coming, he's burning offerings and peace offerings to the Lord. This could be the feast days, this could be a different time. But 3 times Solomon's coming. He's offering these burnt offerings, these peace offerings. And we're just getting to see some of the things that Solomon has done in his other accomplishments and his other doings after building the temple and before we get to the next narrative bit of his life. Solomon also built a fleet of ships at Ezion-Geber, which is near Elath, on the shore of the Red Sea, in the land of Edom. Then Hiram sent his servants with the fleet, seamen who knew the sea, to work with the servants of Solomon. And they went to Ophir and acquired 420 talents of gold from there and brought it to King Solomon. So he also now has a navy. He's got chariots, he's got cavalry, he's now got a navy. And when I say that now 3 times a year he offered him, it could be the feast, it could not. It's not that somebody probably knows. I just cannot remember off the top of my head. That's why I'm saying that. But we get a look at some of the things and the greatness and the power that Solomon has now done. This is what this nation is becoming under the leadership of Solomon, because of the blessing of God. But that great if is going to hang over his head. If your sons, if your descendants keep my commandments, then you will continue in these blessings. If you turn from me, I will make you a cautionary tale. And it's interesting because it's not 1 generation. It's not 2 generations. Each generation and each king gets a chance to make their own decision. Do they follow the Lord and redeem the evil of the previous king? Or do they continue in that evil? Each one has to make their own decision, just as each of us has to make ours. My children are not saved because I'm saved. I'm not unsaved because my grandfather was unsaved. Each of us need to make our own decision. Will we let that if hang over our head? Or will we submit ourselves to the authority of Christ and make sure that we are not entering into the afterlife with an if? As Chuck Smith would say, do you want to enter into heaven with a question mark or with an exclamation point? Do you want to walk into heaven? Do you want to head into the afterlife going, are you saved? Am I saved? I'm saved? Or I'm saved? Which one is it? Because we have the choice whether we let that if hang over our head. Because we are under a much better covenant than King Solomon had. One that came through the final sacrifice of Christ. One that is freely offered to us. It was not freely, it didn't come about freely. There was a great price that had to be paid. The price of our sin, the debt that we racked up was great. But we're not having to repay that now. We're able to enjoy the fruits of His work, the greatest work. And we're able to be grafted into His vine so that we can produce fruits as well. So do we want to live with the if? Or do we want to live with the I am saved with an exclamation point? Because we can be assured of our salvation by submitting ourselves to Christ, by believing in our hearts, professing with our mouths, and producing the fruit that proves our salvation doesn't merit our salvation. It's a question to ponder. Do you want to live your life with a question mark or an exclamation point? Because there are many Christians who live with a question mark. And you can see them in your church. You can see them walk down the street. Because when you see them, you have a question mark too. You look at them and you go, you said you're Christian. I don't know about that one. Or you can see other ones and you say, that one, I can tell. Not because they're constantly holding a Bible or talking about a verse, but because they're constantly walking out in love, in service, and the fruit they produce in the world is just so sweet that it could come from no other source. So, it's a question to ponder. It's a question to take into ourselves and pray about often. Because one day, when we least expect it, our soul will be required of us. And that question will be answered. And there's only one right answer. But anyway, that's where we will stop for today. I hope this was fruitful for you. I hope to see you back again next time. But until then, be blessed.